It was famed author O. Henry who coined the term almost by accident. Shortly after moving to Texas, he wrote a friend saying Austin was, quote, fearfully dull, except for the frequent raids by the servant girl annihilators who make things lively in the dull hours of the night. Classic O. Henry to turn a roaming psychotic killer into a punchline about the lack of a nightlife in 1880s Austin, Texas. Up to that point, the police had simply called the case the Austin Axe Murderers. But it would be O. Henry's words, the servant girl annihilator, that history would remember the killings of 1884 and 1885 Austin. It wasn't entirely accurate, as the killer would soon move beyond servant girls, finally forcing the police to take the killings seriously. Welcome to History is Criminal. In this episode, we jump back to 1880s Austin, Texas. Before H. Holmes and before Jack the Ripper, there was the Austin servant girl annihilator. This unknown psycho would leave at least 8 people in his wake through 1884 and 1885 before vanishing. Austin thought itself a completely modern city, as it had risen from a cow town into a bustling urban frontier. Following the Civil War, the population had grown by 300%. By 1884, it was home to 3 colleges, including the historically black college, Tillotson, Colgate, and Normal Institution. Locals called their city the Athens of the West, a not so humble brag for a city that barely a decade earlier had cattle wandering the main thoroughfare. It was the arrival of the Houston, Texas Central Railway in 1871 that started the boom. By 1872 would see the city named the final site for the state capital. There seemed to have been some serious debate over where to put the capital in Texas. The investment of the post-Civil War Reconstruction era would totally transform the city, at least on the surface. By the 1880s, the city was home to Anglo-Americans, Irish and German immigrants, a growing Hispanic population, and African Americans. And believe it or not, Texas in the 1880s was, well, a little racist. I know, it's hard to believe. Even with this, Austin seemed to be a city with little crime. What crime was reported seemed to be dealt with quickly. In 1884, it was a safe little city with modern gas lamps on new sidewalks, lighting the way for workers in the morning and night as workers and shoppers made their way around this little western utopia. At least that's how the city presented itself to the outside world until the night of December 30th, 1884. Molly Smith worked as a servant for a wealthy Hall family who lived in a large home on Pecan Street, today 6th Street. She cooked for the family while her common-law husband, Walter Spencer, was responsible for various tasks from yard work, caring for animals, and home repairs. They had settled in on a cold December 30th night as snow lightly covered the ground. I know you don't think of Austin, Texas as having snow, but surprise, 1884, December 30th, snow on the ground. That actually kind of becomes important. The snow lightly covered the ground as they went to sleep in their cabin located behind the main house. Spencer woke with a pain shooting through his body. He got to his feet and saw his image in the mirror. Blood was streaming down his face. Only then did he notice their humble shack had been ransacked, and more importantly, Molly was missing. Tracking Molly's location was easy in the snow. Tracks and blood led to the outhouse, and it was there that Spencer found the horrible scene. Molly had not only been killed, but brutalized. Wounds to her face, chest, and arms, they would be estimated at 24 axe wounds. Additionally, a sharp object had been driven through her ear into her brain. Austin had seen murders before, but this was something different. The level of violence was beyond that anyone had seen. There also didn't seem to be any motive. Why would someone attack a sleeping black servant couple, dragging the wife outside and subjecting her to tremendously violent slaughter? Robbery didn't seem to be a motive. A treasure trove set in the main house just yards away. As far as some type of revenge, what could 2 poor working people have done to cause such a degree of anger? Police made a search of the couple's home and found a blood-covered axe. Naturally, suspicion fell on Spencer, but his own wounds made it very unlikely that he was the perpetrator. A murder of this type, without a doubt, would draw the attention of everyone. But this was the Jim Crow era South, and the murder of a poor African American would be the highest of priorities. The police did, however, note that the tracks left by the culprit were barefoot. Then, the case went cold for the next 6 months, or maybe only 3, depending on who you ask. The black community was clearly already seeing a pattern. The Austin Weekly Statesman ran a story on page 4 about an attack on 2 servant girls. They were woke up with a knock on the door demanding entrance. They refused, so the attacker opened a window. The girls screamed and made a run for it, but the would-be attacker caught one of the girls, tackling her from behind. Fortunately for her, her screams caused help to come, and the attacker fled. In that same edition of the paper, they ran a small blurb on page 5 of the 6-page paper titled, "The Song of the Servant Girl." "Oh, I've gone and bought me a gun, and I mean to learn how to shoot. I'm gonna have a barrel of fun by plugging a prowling galoot." Now, despite this attempt at dark humor, it also states that of the 1,357 servant girls in Austin, 947 had quit their jobs out of fear, and many of the others had begun sleeping in their mistresses' homes. It seems there were more attacks than those reported, and the black community clearly knew the intended targets were servant girls, even if the authorities failed to see an obvious connection. The next edition of the Weekly Statesman reported on March 26, 1885, there were 4 reported attacks on women in Austin in the days leading up to publication. While the majority were black, 2 Swedish servant girls were also victims of attacks. In their case, the attacker had used a gun, while the attacks on the black women were all done with edged weapons. 2 of the attacks on black servant women resulted in arrest of known suspects. The attack on the Swedish servants and at least 1 of the black servant women resulted in no arrest and no suspects. While some lumped these attacks in with the servant girl Annihilator, others didn't seem to make the connection. The 2 Swedes were attacked by 2 men who they couldn't identify, who used a gun, a clear break from the victimology and MO of the earlier attacks. The attack on the 3rd black victim did seem to match the pattern that would be established by the Annihilator, attacked in her home while sleeping with an edged weapon. But it remains unclear whether this is the work of the same killer. What is clear is that people were starting to ask questions. The Weekly Statesman attacked the local government over its perceived inaction. Quote, "The city government has been doing its old way, taking no notice of the terrible period of anarchy reigning in our midst. The murdered servant girls' bloodshed in December last elicited no reaction. Neither did the attempted murder of 2 servant girls on Wednesday night." The article claimed that if the city would have put special officers on the case following the attack on Molly Smith, they could have prevented much of the violence that was now engulfing the city. In keeping with the times, the story on May 6th of the Weekly Statesman starts off talking about Dr. L.B. Johnson, quote, "A well-known citizen of this city, went to market yesterday morning." Towards the end of that opening paragraph, after explaining where the doctor's home was located, it tells of a, quote, "colored woman named Eliza Shelley." She lived in a cabin on the doctor's property and was an employee as a cook. In the second paragraph, we learn that the good doctor returning from shopping found that his wife and niece had discovered Eliza had been murdered. Now, talk about burying the lead. After giving us a look into the effect the murder had on the young white girl, who was sent to see what all the screaming was about. So, hearing the screaming coming from the cook shack, the doctor's wife sent her niece, described only as a little girl, to see what was going on. The girl, who only glanced in the door quickly, ran back to the main house. Seeing the girl in shock, her aunt went to the shack herself and glanced in and saw blood. Then ran back home and waited for the doctor to return. Now, I just want to unpack some stuff here. We'll ignore that the story fails to focus on the murder until almost 2 full paragraphs in, but You hear panic screaming and send a child to check it out. She returns, quote, pale and excited, so you go to see what's going on. You see enough to realize that something very bad has happened. Then you wait for your husband to return from the market before getting the police. Dr. Johnson entered the room and looked close enough to see that Eliza was very much dead. What appeared to be an axe wound above her eye had caused massive damage. He noticed other smaller wounds, likely from a knife, and a hole above her ear. And, by the way, Eliza's 3 sons were also in the room, alive, but clearly traumatized. We don't learn that until about paragraph 4 of the story. The article states that only one of the boys was old enough to give an account of what had happened, reportedly around 8 years old. A man had entered the room and asked where his mother kept the money. He didn't know, so the man told him to cover his head, saying if he didn't, he would kill him. It seems the boy didn't know his mother had been killed until the next morning, having fallen asleep with his head covered, when he awoke, seeing the body, and started screaming. Now, the boy had told Mrs. Johnson that the killer was white, but had a rag over his face. The article also says the boy seemed confused about the race of the murderer, but gives no contradictory statements saying the killer was black. So to 1880s Texas, the killer had to be black, even though the boy said he was white. Once again, barefoot tracks were found outside the cabin. Later that afternoon, Andrew Williams, described as a half-witted 19-year-old black man, was arrested on suspicion of murder. It seems that a lot of the evidence against him was the fact that he was barefoot at the time of his arrest. A barefoot, poor, black 19-year-old in 1885 Texas. Something tells me that wasn't all that rare. The article says that his feet were measured and will be compared later. We can assume that they didn't close the case. William would be released later that same day. I assume the shoe didn't fit, literally. It was about this time that O. Henry wrote his letter to a friend creating the name the servant girl Annihilator. Today, this is the name that is often connected with the crimes. Contemporary newspapers do not use the moniker, instead talking about the tragedy in Austin, the Austin axe murders, and the Midnight Assassin. But in most cases, the papers gave no title to the killer. Having read many of these articles in the Weekly Statesman, they don't even seem to really connect the killings, except for to say that another servant girl murder. And in one case, under the headline, Troublesome Blacks. Now, while O. Henry was surely at least partly referring to the series of killings, it's important to note that violence against poor women, the working class, was all too common in Austin, which is why it took a little while for the police to notice a pattern. The killer didn't wait long to strike again. 2 weeks passed. Irene Cross, again an African-American servant, was attacked in her bed. Reportedly, the police were able to speak to Irene just before she died from her wounds, yet little information of value was gained. The attack only differed in the use of the weapon. This time, the killer had used a knife. Until this point, he had used an axe, leading the police to refer to the killings as the Austin Axe Murderer. O. Henry, having written his famous letter already, but that name had not caught on. Now, even though the killer used a knife this time, that did not dampen the violence. The police said that her arm had been cut so badly that it was almost removed from her body. A reporter for the Weekly Statesman who was on the crime scene said it looked like Irene had been scalped. Early summer seemed to be a cooling off period for the killer. No attacks attributed to the Annihilator took place in either June or July. Citizens of Austin might have figured or at least hoped that the killer had stopped, moved on, or maybe even died. In August, the dark story became even darker. Becky Ramey was the 40-year-old servant employed by V.O. Weed. Weed told the Galveston Daily News that about 4 in the morning on August 30th, he and his wife heard moaning coming from the kitchen. Apparently, the sound was enough to wake them. He followed the sounds to the kitchen where he found Becky in a pool of blood, but alive. She was even trying to stand up. Mr. Weed summoned both the doctor and the police. Now, see, Miss Johnson, that's how you do it. You get the police and help. You don't wait or send a child to go see what's happening. It was only then that he realized that Becky's 11-year-old daughter was not in her room. Spotting footprints, they began to search the grounds and found Mary's body in the wash-house. She had been beaten, raped, and stabbed in both ears, likely with a screwdriver. She was alive when they first discovered her, but would soon pass from her injuries. Police brought in bloodhounds. The dogs traced the scent for 2 blocks, coming to a stable. Inside, they found Henry Taylor. Taylor was a black laborer employed by the man who owned the stable. He was taken back to the Weed home, and his foot compared to the tracks located in the yard. Police claimed they were an exact match, including a particularly shaped toe. The police stated that they were almost certain Taylor was the killer. Turns out, they were wrong. The murders were getting noticed across Texas in the Galveston Daily News. The story says, another of those most horrible murders for which Austin is becoming notorious occurred last night, and again, a servant girl was the victim. The city of Austin and local authorities were now on edge. September 26th, this killer would strike once again. This time, he took 2 victims. He also left 2 survivors. Gracie Vance woke to a man standing over her bed. Her screaming woke her husband, Orange Washington, who sprang into action ready to fight off the killer. Unfortunately, the psycho was ready for Orange, and a quick axe blow killed Orange instantly. The killer turned to Gracie, knocking her unconscious. Then he attacked 2 other servants sleeping in the same room. He bludgeoned the 2 women and then raped them. He then returned to Gracie, killing her. The 2 other victims survived, but were unable to offer much in the way of details. They were only able to tell that the killer spoke to them, telling her not to look at him. Only 2 things that came to light were Gracie was found holding a gold watch that didn't belong to anybody who lived in the home, and that the killer had gained entrance to the home through a window. As the trail went cold, once again, the police found themselves with too many suspects. Over 400 men had been brought in for questioning. Husbands and boyfriends were questioned, but none seemed to be promising. The city did start to take some actions, beefing up patrols and improving the lighting on some streets. People stopped going out at night and took steps to safeguard their homes. Bars even started to close early. It was a possible comfort to the white Austin residents that up until this point, all the victims had been black, and all but orange servant girls. That was about to change. The last 2 victims of the Annihilator were both white women, both attacked on the 24th of December, 1885. The 2 would be killed only about an hour apart in 2 different locations. The first was Susan Hancock. Susan and her husband were sleeping in separate rooms, although some sources say he had actually fallen asleep in a chair when the killer entered their home and dragged Susan out of the house. She was taken to the garden where she was killed. The cause of death was, like the earlier killings, blow to the heads with a sharp object. It was also reported that metal was seen protruding from her head, and her head had been opened in 2 pieces. Less than an hour later, the body of Eula Phillips was found in an alley in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods of Austin. These killings were a dramatic break from the M.O. of the Annihilator. Both were well-off white women. Hancock was described as one of the finest women of Austin. In the Phillips case, her husband was also attacked. Reportedly, Eula was taken from the home and into the alley, although in this case, some claim the evidence points to 2 culprits. The speculation was based largely on the fact that heavy timbers were placed across parts of the body, either to hide it or to hold her down during the attack. It seemed unlikely that one attacker could both control Eula and move the heavy timbers. But that only makes an argument if she was still capable of fighting back at the point timbers were placed on the body. It does seem that the Annihilator often knocked his victims unconscious before raping and killing them, and in some cases, not in that order. People questioned if the attacks were actually the work of the Annihilator. It would be Phillips' case that would raise the most questions. People were so sure that Eula Phillips was not an Annihilator victim that her husband, James Phillips, was arrested and convicted of her murder. The prosecution told the story of a jealous man who had threatened her if she ever cheated on him. By contemporary accounts, Eula was a very attractive woman, with men often stopping to watch her pass by. It was also rumored that she was having an affair with a local politician. They painted the tale of a man who used the Annihilator killings as a cover for the murder of his wife. They presented very little real evidence aside from the bloodhounds brought in to track the killer that initially went back into Philip's home. This was taken to mean that James had killed Eula, then went back inside the home to stage the attack on himself. The defense pointed out the fact that James had also been attacked and had an axe wound to the back of his head. That would be a little tough to self-inflict. There were also bloody footprints at the scene that didn't match James's feet. Hungry to find someone guilty, he was convicted. He spent 6 months in jail until his conviction was overturned for a lack of evidence. Moses Hancock, husband of Susan, was also arrested and tried, but he was acquitted of the crime. Phillips would be the last of the servant girl Annihilator murders. So, who was the Annihilator? Despite the court tossing the conviction of Mr. Phillips, it still seems possible that he killed his wife with the help of a second unknown suspect. Although an axe to the head is a risky way to try and cover your tracks. If that is the case, then it's very unlikely he was connected to any of the other murders. He had wounds from the attack that were not life-threatening, but still an axe to the head that left him unconscious. But that level of planning and execution would have made it nearly impossible for him to have had any part in the Hancock attack less than an hour earlier. It also seems crazy to suggest he started killing black servant girls a year earlier as part of a plan to cover up the murder of his wife that he was planning a year in the future. As for Hancock, the evidence is even more limited, but with the death of an upper-class woman, an arrest had to be made. Just like Phillips, if Hancock did kill his wife, then it still seems very unlikely that he committed any of the earlier Annihilator killings, and also almost impossible to have committed the Phillips killing as he was being interviewed with police at the time of that attack. Austin police did come up with two solid suspects. The first was Nathan Elgin, a 19-year-old African-American cook who worked near many of the killing sites. Modern profilers really like Elgin as a suspect. He seems to fit the mold of a young serial killer growing his style of murder. If you take into account the earlier non-lethal attacks of servant women in Austin, then you see a building of the violence. There was also the story that the footprints in at least one crime scene matched Elgin's. These were the footprints entered into evidence by the defense at the Phillips trial that the jury seemed to ignore. It seems that both only had 4 toes on one foot. It's also convenient that Elgin was shot and killed by police in February 1886, just 2 months after the last Annihilator killing. Elgin had grabbed a girl by the name of Julia from a saloon and dragged her, kicking and screaming, to his nearby home. Neighbors were aroused, as was police officer John Bracken. 2 men aided Officer Bracken in getting Elgin away from the girl and out of the house. Unwilling to give up, a struggle took place on the lawn, with Elgin breaking free. Elgin then made an often fatal mistake of bringing a knife to a gunfight. As he drew his knife, Bracken drew his gun. The shot brought Elgin down, passing through his gut and into his spine. He died from his wounds the next morning. This didn't stop James Phillips from being tried and convicted for his wife's murder. That trial took place in June 1886. But the second suspect was also on the radar of the Austin police. He is known only as Maurice, a Malaysian cook. He had spent most of his life cooking aboard ships, and had landed a job at an Austin hotel in 1885. The evidence against Maurice seems a little weak. He arrived in 1885 and stayed until January of 1886, so he would have been in town for the killings, but would have arrived too late for the earlier non-lethal attacks. Austin was convinced the killer had to be either a black man or maybe one of the many foreigners that were arriving in Austin. So we had this great combination of racism and xenophobia. Although witnesses had described the killer as white, black, and yellow, an older term for a light-skinned black man, at times his face was also said to be covered with some kind of cloth. So the newly arriving Malaysian cook was as good a suspect as anyone. Maurice left Austin in 1886, that January, just 1 month after the last murder. The story has him traveling to New Orleans and then to London, arriving just before the start of the Jack the Ripper killings. Of course, this has led some to conclude that Maurice was both the servant girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper, fitting the theory that the Ripper might have been a sailor who had come in and out of London. Thus, the abrupt end to those killings. Although any evidence for this seems to be mostly conjecture and speculation. Now, it is worth noting that 4 other black servant girls were attacked in their beds before the killing of Molly Smith. In July 1884, 2 women were stabbed in the face while they were sleeping. In August, a 3rd servant woman was struck in the head with an iron as she slept. Then in November, police reported a 4th servant woman being attacked in her bed. Police investigated all 4 of these crimes as if they were unrelated incidents. Newspapers largely overlooked these crimes. Had police taken the assault on poor black women as serious as assault on white women, it's possible lives could have been saved. The case is officially unsolved and was overshadowed by H. Holmes, who was uncovered just months later, and of course by the most famous unsolved serial killer of all time, Jack the Ripper, 2 years later. This has been History is Criminal. Come back next week as we jump to 1890s France and the story of Joseph Vacher, sometimes called the French Jack the Ripper. Until then, if you like what you heard, tell a friend, and if not, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.